I've spent decades behind this bench, and I've become quite the connoisseur of entitlement. But even I wasn't prepared for the morning Chloe Vanderwall, heiress to the Vanderwall telecommunications empire, decided to make my courtroom her personal stage. She walked through those heavy oak doors not like a defendant facing charges of reckless endangerment and public intoxication, but like a CEO inspecting a branch office she intended to shut down. Behind her trailed not one, but 3 attorneys from a firm that bills by the minute men in bespoke suits that cost more than a public defender's annual salary. She was wearing a custom-tailored silk pantsuit that practically shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, clutching a designer bag that likely carried a waiting list longer than the docket on my desk. Her expression was a masterclass in contempt. It was the look of someone who has lived her entire life in a world where no is a sound she's never actually heard. She didn't look at the clerk, she didn't look at the bailiff, and she certainly didn't look at me. She scanned the gallery with the detached boredom of a woman checking a flight board at the airport, clearly annoyed that she was even here. Her entourage moved in formation, a protective bubble of wealth that seemed to believe it could displace the air in my courtroom. When she finally took her seat at the defense table, she didn't sit, she settled, crossing her legs with a sharp, deliberate movement, checking her diamond-encrusted watch as if she had a brunch reservation to make in 10 minutes. The bailiff announced the start of the proceedings, and the room grew silent. It was a silence born of anticipation. Everyone in that courtroom, the court reporters, the plaintiffs, the families waiting for justice, they all knew exactly who Chloe Vanderwall was. Her face had been plastered across the tabloids for the better part of a week, and she knew it too. She didn't look worried. She looked like she was waiting for an apology from us. As she glanced at the empty space where her father, the man whose name opened every door in this city, should have been sitting, she adjusted her posture. The arrogance wasn't just on her face. It was in the way she held the space around her, a bubble of privilege that had yet to meet a needle. I looked down at the case file, the charges of endangering a busy city intersection, the damage to public property, the complete disregard for anyone's safety but her own, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. Mr. Thorne, her lead counsel, stood up. He didn't offer a preamble. He went straight for the narrative he'd clearly workshopped for days. According to him, the incident at the local community center, the one where Miss Chloe Vanderwall allegedly manhandled Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, was a gross exaggeration of a private dispute between 2 individuals who simply had a difference of opinion. He used words like animated discussion and unfortunate lack of personal space rather than shoving or battery. As he spoke, Chloe didn't just sit there. She was animated, in the worst possible way. She was leaning over to her aide, whispering, and every time the attorney painted the victim as an aggressor, Chloe would let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. It wasn't the nervous titter of a defendant who fears the gavel. It was the cruel, sharp sound of someone who finds the very idea of standing trial for bothering the help genuinely hilarious. Across the aisle, Mrs. Jenkins sat motionless. She was a woman who had spent 40 years running a local bakery, a woman whose hands were calloused from kneading dough and whose face was etched with the lines of hard work. She held her purse in her lap with a grip that turned her knuckles white. She didn't look at Chloe. She didn't look at the defense team. She just stared straight ahead, a statue of quiet dignity amidst the storm of manufactured lies. I watched the power dynamic play out in real time. It was as textbook as it gets. The wealth, the influence, the legal team polished to a mirror finish, all arrayed against a woman who simply wanted to be treated with a baseline level of human decency. Chloe's attorneys were crafting a version of reality where their client was the victim of an overly sensitive public, while the victim was being painted as a gold digger looking for a payout. The contempt was palpable. Every time Mr. Thorne minimized the physical contact, Chloe would smirk, looking around the room as if asking the gallery to join in on the joke. She was absolutely convinced that the courtroom was just another social setting she could dominate. She didn't see a judge. She saw a minor hurdle in her afternoon itinerary. She didn't see a victim. She saw a nuisance. And in that moment, I realized exactly how much work we had to do to strip away the insulation that had protected her for 24 years. The air in the room grew heavy, a pressure cooker of arrogance meeting the hard, cold reality of the law. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice cutting through the polished, rehearsed air of the room like a cold front. "I let you finish because this is a court of law, not a public relations firm's boardroom. But let's be very clear about what we are actually discussing here." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. It was the suffocating silence of anticipation. The gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. Mr. Thorne's practiced, neutral expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but he managed to maintain a veneer of professional calm. You referred to this as an animated discussion and an unfortunate lack of personal space, I continued, leaning forward until the bench felt like a cockpit. I don't see a lack of space, Mr. Thorne. I see a young woman who believed she had the right to walk into a place of business and command a space that wasn't hers. And when that command was denied, when a simple no was offered, she decided to exert force. That is not an animated discussion. That is an assault. Chloe, who had been busy whispering into her aide's ear, stopped mid-sentence. She looked up at me, not with fear, but with a lingering, insolent irritation, as if I had interrupted her from a far more important task. She even let out a small, sharp huff of breath that sounded distinctly like a laugh. It was a rookie mistake. She didn't understand the geography of this room yet. Your client is laughing, I noted, my voice dropping to a register that signaled the end of my patience. She seems to think this is a sketch comedy, not a proceeding that carries the weight of a criminal charge. She might want to save that amusement for the sentencing phase. Bailiff, cue the recording. I want to see the footage. The full, unedited 47 seconds. Mr. Thorne tried to interject, stammering something about media manipulation and cherry-picked context, but I held up a single, firm hand. The gavel wasn't necessary yet. My presence was enough to silence the room. This court does not need media context, Mr. Thorne. It needs the objective truth of what happened on that sidewalk. If the media framed it, it is only because the frame is made of your client's own behavior. Play the video. The large screen mounted above the gallery flickered to life. The high-definition footage appeared, crisp and damning. 47 seconds that would strip away every piece of insulation Chloe had ever known. The room went deathly still. The footage showed the approach. Chloe, walking with that predatory, unhurried ease of someone who has never been told to wait. Then, the interaction. Mrs. Jenkins standing firm, calm, professional, and then, the shift. Chloe's face didn't show distress or confusion. It showed entitlement weaponized. The screen went black, but the image of the shove remained burned into everyone's retinas. The courtroom was saturated with a heavy, stifling silence. Mrs. Jenkins hadn't moved an inch, her face a mask of sorrowful endurance. Chloe, on the other hand, finally shifted. The practiced, bored nonchalance was slipping, replaced by a flicker of irritation, not at the violence of her actions, but at the fact that she was being forced to witness them in such an unforgiving format. She adjusted her silk cuff, avoiding the eyes of the gallery, her jaw set tight. I didn't look at the screen. I kept my gaze fixed on her. I looked at the young woman who had spent her entire life believing she could rewrite physics and morality simply by having enough zeros in her bank account. The attorneys were exchanging frantic, low-voiced whispers, their earlier confidence eroding under the sheer brutal clarity of the evidence. Mrs. Vanderwall, I said, my voice steady, stripped of all theatrics. Your attorney just spent 20 minutes explaining to this court that what we just watched was a misunderstanding, an animated discussion. I'd like to hear your version. In your own words, tell the court what happened in those 47 seconds. Her lead counsel, Thorne, started to rise, his face flushed with the kind of performative indignation reserved for high-stakes litigation. Your Honor, my client has already provided a statement to— I didn't ask you, Mr. Thorne. I cut him off, the gavel meeting the desk with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed like a gunshot in the hushed room. She is a defendant in a court of law, not a client at a board meeting. Sit down. He sat. The air in the room felt thinner. Chloe looked at him, then at the empty air, then finally at me. She was still trying to find a way to spin it, searching for the magic words that usually made problems disappear. She opened her mouth, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in the armor. She wasn't just a spoiled heiress anymore. She was someone who had just realized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that the script she had been handed didn't work here. It was just a misunderstanding, she began, her voice lacking the practiced poise she'd had 10 minutes ago. The woman she was being difficult. She didn't have the order ready. I was in a hurry. It was just a stupid flower arrangement. I don't see why we're making such a huge scene out of something so trivial. The gallery gasped, a collective, involuntary sound of disbelief. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't even acknowledged the physical harm. She had managed to insult the victim, the court, and the very concept of the law in 2 sentences. She still thought she was the victim. I leaned back, resting my elbows on the bench, watching her carefully. This was the moment. The mask of the victim was off, and the reality of her character was sitting bare for everyone to see. She truly believed her inconvenience justified violence. And that, more than anything else, was exactly why we were there. The silence that followed her statement was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake. Chloe Vanderwall sat there, having just dismissed a violent assault as a stupid flower arrangement, her expression still holding that sneering, untouchable quality. She clearly expected the room to nod along, expected the judge to sigh, and let her go back to her world of private jets and gated estates. I didn't reach for my gavel. I didn't need to. I simply sat there, watching her, letting the weight of her own words settle into the floorboards. The attorneys were frozen, eyes darting between me and their client, suddenly realizing the trap she had walked into. I leaned back, looking at her not as a defendant, but as a textbook example of a sickness that has plagued our society for far too long. "Mrs. Vanderwall," I said, my voice quiet, almost conversational, which made the chill in the room even more pronounced. "You just told this court that you think this proceeding is an embarrassment. You told me that because of your father's name and because of your status, you shouldn't be sitting in this chair." I paused, letting her smile fade just a fraction. "In my courtroom, your father's name is a sound, nothing more. It carries no currency, no weight, and it buys you absolutely nothing. You walked in here thinking you were above the law, that your life operates on a different plane of existence. You are mistaken." I turned my head toward the bailiff, who was already standing, his face impassive. "Bailiff, take her into custody. She is remanded to the local jail for criminal contempt of court, in addition to the original assault and endangerment charges." The reaction was instantaneous. The lawyers were on their feet in a blur of motion, voices rising in a cacophony of objections, but it was too late. The reality of the cold steel cuffs clicking against her wrists echoed through the room. Chloe's face, for the first time, lost its color. The sneer vanished, replaced by a look of profound, dawning horror. She wasn't looking at the ceiling anymore. She was looking at the bailiff, then at me. The realization finally breaking through the wall of privilege. The rules had changed, and she was the one who had written her own sentence. The fallout was not immediate, but when it hit, it arrived with the crushing force of a structural collapse. Outside the courthouse, the media circus had reached a fever pitch. By the time Chloe was processed and placed in a holding cell, her mugshot, that image of her, eyes wide with the sudden, jarring realization that the silk suit wouldn't protect her, had been shared millions of times. It was a digital guillotine. Back in the boardrooms of Vanderwall Telecommunications, the narrative was shifting. Arthur Vanderwall, the titan of industry who had spent decades curating a legacy of cold, calculated dominance, understood something his daughter clearly did not. You cannot fight a fire by pouring gasoline on it. I sat in my chambers, watching the news feed. Arthur didn't issue a statement demanding her release or questioning the court's jurisdiction. He didn't threaten the bench with his immense political capital. Instead, he issued a press release that was a masterpiece of corporate distancing. It read, "The Vanderwall family believes in the absolute rule of law. We are disappointed by the recent events, and we expect Chloe to take full responsibility for her actions." It was a death sentence for her confidence. In the holding cell, when her attorneys relayed her father's statement, the look on Chloe's face was not one of defiance. It was the look of a child who had just been abandoned on a battlefield she had been told was hers to command. She had expected a rescue, a phone call to a senator, a check written to make the world stop turning. Instead, she got a PR statement that effectively cut the strings of her puppet. The following morning, when she was brought back to my courtroom for the continuation of the trial, the air was different. The three high-priced attorneys were still there, but they looked diminished, their shoulders slumped as if they were already preparing for the loss. Chloe sat at the defense table, but the shimmer was gone. She looked small. She looked human. She finally understood that the world she had lived in, a world where consequences were for other people, was a fantasy. She had spent 24 years thinking she was the protagonist in a story written just for her, only to discover she was merely an asset to be liquidated for the sake of the bottom line. The power didn't fail because the judge was strong. It failed because the foundation it was built on, that belief that money supersedes humanity, had finally cracked under the pressure of a single, honest, 4-7-second recording. 3 days later, Chloe Vanderwall stood before me again. The transformation was not just physical, though the absence of the Chanel jacket, the designer jewelry, and the entourage was striking. She wore a standard-issue gray blouse, her hair pulled back into a simple, severe knot. The arrogance that had fueled her entrance last time had been replaced by a hollow, brittle exhaustion. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept since the moment the cell door slammed shut behind her. The courtroom was packed, but it was quiet, a respectful, attentive silence that stood in stark contrast to the circus atmosphere of her initial arrival. Mr. Thorne was still there, but he looked like a man trying to distance himself from a sinking ship. He didn't offer any opening arguments. He didn't try to spin the narrative. He simply stood by her, looking at the floor, waiting for the inevitable. I looked down at the file. Then slowly, deliberately, I looked up at Chloe. "Mrs. Vanderwall," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. "In the last 72 hours, you have had a great deal of time to contemplate the nature of your actions. You have had time to realize that there is no amount of money, no family name, and no legal strategy that can rewrite the reality of what you did. You assaulted a woman who was simply trying to do her job. You threatened her livelihood. And then, standing in this court, you had the audacity to call this process an embarrassment." She didn't look up. Her hands, folded tightly in her lap, were trembling just slightly. "I find you guilty on all counts of assault, criminal endangerment, and contempt of court," I declared. The gavel struck, a sound that seemed to reverberate against the walls. "Your sentence is as follows. You will serve 90 days in the county correctional facility, suspended pending 2 years of active supervised probation. You will pay full restitution to Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, covering the medical expenses for her wrist, the full replacement cost of her equipment, and lost wages for the 6 weeks she was unable to work. Furthermore, you will complete 300 hours of community service at the city's emergency food distribution center. You will work the floor, you will assist the elderly, and you will learn exactly what it means to serve the community you thought you were above." I leaned over the bench, making sure she had to look me in the eye. "You don't get to choose the charity, Chloe. You don't get a gala. You will go where the city needs you, and you will offer a written apology to Mrs. Jenkins, which I will review personally before it is published in every local paper where your video went viral. If you fail to comply with a single detail of this sentence, the suspended jail time will be activated immediately. Do you understand?" She swallowed hard, her eyes glassing over. Yes, Your Honor, I understand." It was the first time she had sounded like a person instead of a brand. The courtroom seemed to exhale. The justice that had been so elusive in the early days of this case was finally, undeniably, being served. Chloe's community service was the great equalizer. There were no cameras, no lawyers, no special treatment at the emergency food distribution center. For the first time in her life, she was judged not by the name on her birth certificate or the brand on her bag, but by the speed and efficiency with which she could prep vegetables for a soup kitchen. She wore a standard-issue uniform that washed out her complexion, and for the first few weeks, she was clumsy, entitled, and openly resentful. But week by week, as the work stripped away the layers of vanity she had used as armor, something shifted. She learned that scrubbing floors isn't a task for the help, it's a task for anyone who wants to keep a place clean. Sarah Jenkins, meanwhile, didn't look for fame or a massive payout. She returned to her bakery, but it was different now. The community had rallied around her, not out of pity, but out of respect. People came from across the city, lining up around the block, holding handwritten notes that echoed a simple sentiment: "We see you. We're here." She didn't frame the settlement check, she framed the handwritten apology. Chloe was forced to write, a document that was stiff and awkward, clearly drafted with heavy guidance, but it existed. For Sarah, the document wasn't a victory trophy, it was simply a record that truth had won, even if just for a day. Arthur Vanderwall's empire didn't crumble overnight, but the narrative changed. The incident and the subsequent arrest became a case study in the boardroom, a cautionary tale about the liability of unchecked privilege. He didn't seek a third term for his political endorsements, and the public discourse around his family shifted from admiration to scrutiny. The distinction between their explanations, family matters versus moral failure, became the defining gap in his legacy. I keep a copy of that original 4-7-second transcript in the top drawer of my desk. I don't look at it for the drama or the spectacle. I look at it for the silence that followed the recording, the moment when the truth became so undeniable that even the most expensive lawyers in the state had nothing left to say. My job isn't to be a kingmaker or a destroyer. My job is to ensure that when people walk through my doors, they understand one fundamental principle. In this room, You are not a governor's wife, a CEO's daughter, or a billionaire's heir. You are a person who made a choice, and you are here to account for it. The title beside your name is a vapor. What you do when you're finally caught, that is the only thing that ever stays on the record.